one of the questions we get asked most frequently is what kind of bit do we recommend? So that's what we're going to take a look at in this video. Now, a big mistake we see a lot of people making is thinking that changing to a particular bit is going to solve all of your problems by putting the pressure in particular places in your horse's mouth. And that might work in the short term, but all too often it just introduces other problems further down the track. And you'll sometimes see people changing from one bit to another and then on to yet another as they chase the answers to all the different issues that they're running into. So actually, most of the solution to most things that look like bit problems are actually about what you're doing with your hands at the other end of the reins. And when you know how to use it well, the bit isn't something that you use to force your horse to do things just because they're trying to avoid pain. It actually becomes a really subtle communication device that you can use to have a two-way conversation with your horse. Now, in the course of riding, there are going to be times when you might want to ask your horse to change their balance by raising their head and neck, to bend to one side or to the other, to flex their poll so that their nose comes closer to the vertical, to open their poll so that the nose is a bit more in front, or even to take the reins forward and extend their neck all the way to horizontal. And if your horse has a tendency to do any of those things when you don't actually want them to, well, you also need to know how to ask for the opposite so that you can correct the situation. Now, the most effective and most horse-friendly way to ask for all those things is by firstly having a light following contact with the corners of your horse's lips, and then using your hands in very horse-friendly ways, either upwards or sideways, to ask for the things that you want. And we do explain exactly how to do all of that in our Schooling Made Simple program. But to be able to succeed with any of those things, it's important firstly that the bit's actually comfortable in your horse's mouth, and then secondly that it gives you and your horse a clear way to communicate with each other without muddying the waters. So the bit that we use most often with horses who are at the beginning of training, or even older horses who haven't yet been schooled all that well, is a fulmer or a full cheek snaffle. So here's an example of a fulmer snaffle. And the first thing you'll notice is that it actually has full cheeks. So these are these big metal bits sticking out the side here. And they serve to keep the bit basically centered in the mouth so that it doesn't get pulled from side to side. Now, obviously, you don't want to be pulling on your horse's mouth, but also you have to teach your horse not to pull against your hands. And, we all know that sometimes horses will try to throw their head to one side or to the other. So if that happens in the early stages of training, the cheeks just really help to keep things comfortable by keeping the bit centralized in the mouth. Now, you'll see that it also has smooth corners here. I'll just highlight that for you. So there's absolutely no risk here of the metal on the bit actually catching your horse's lips, because obviously that would be a bit of a disaster. So definitely something we don't want to happen. And you'll notice this one has got one joint in the center here. Let me just clear that up a little bit. So it's got one joint in the center here. And the joint is actually a very useful thing to have because it allows you to act on one side of the bit or the other, and for those actions to be independent and not necessarily affecting what's going on the other side of your horse's mouth. Now, the reins are going to be attached to the bit rings here, and what you'll see with this particular bit, the fulmer, is that the ring itself is completely isolated from the main mouthpiece of the bit, actually. It passes through a little piece of metal here, and the bit ring is free to rotate in both directions there. And also the rein is free to move up and down around the ring as well. So there's a complete range of freedom here, and you're not going to be causing the bit to twist or to turn in the horse's mouth anytime you take up contact or indeed use the reins in any way. Now, one of the other reasons that we like these bits is that they're actually, generally speaking, really easy to find. You can find them in most tack shops or online stores as well. And actually, they're cheap as chips, generally. You don't have to spend a huge amount of money to get a bit that is going to be comfortable and that's actually going to work really well. And one of the other reasons that I like these bits personally actually is because they're really easy if you're working from the ground. Because the ring is separate out from the cheek pieces, it's really easy to get your fingers and thumbs around the bit, and you can work in hand, work on the ground really quite easily without feeling that the horse is going to nibble your fingers or that you're getting in the way of the horse's face. Now, this is another very common possibility that you'll see. This is a loose ring snaffle, and you'll see it's very similar to the one that we saw previously. It's got the same single joint in the middle. The main difference here is the way that the rings actually pass through the mouthpiece. And if you imagine, in this case, the soft flesh of your horse's mouth is going to be round about here, on each side of the bit. And unfortunately, there is a bit of a risk with these kind of bits that you can pinch the soft tissue of the horse's lip in this little gap just here in between where the ring passes through the end of the mouthpiece. So I'm not saying don't use them, but it's definitely something to watch out for if you are using a loose ring snaffle like this. And another factor to think about is because you don't have the cheek pieces on this bit, actually it's very, very easy for these bits to be pulled through the horse's mouth. As I mentioned earlier, that could be because you're being a bit strong with the rein, but it can also be because the horse isn't yet well enough schooled and decides to just look in the other direction. Even though you might be asking them to turn right, they want to look left, and there's just a massive risk that the bit can actually pass. In fact, it can literally slide all the way through the mouth if you're not careful with those. Now, this is a D-ring snaffle, and it's pretty obvious where it gets its name. You can see the D shape at the end of the bit here. And the ring is nice and smooth, so again, the rein is free to slide in both directions. And because of that slight D shape, although it doesn't have full cheeks, you do get the benefit of some stability in the horse's mouth. Now, one of the advantages of not having the full cheeks, I guess, is that you've simply got less metal to worry about. So if you're using a Fulmer snaffle or a full cheek snaffle, and a full cheek snaffle, actually, it's constructed pretty much like this one. It's just that you would have pieces of metal coming out at either end like so. So it sort of looks very similar to a Fulmer snaffle, but the difference being that with a Fulmer you've got this extra little piece of metal that comes out the side and the bit ring actually passes through that, whereas in this case you can see that the bit ring as such actually forms part of the cheek piece on the side of the bit. So the advantage, as I say, is there's less metal to worry about. If you are using a Fulmer, you do need to be a bit careful where your horse is sticking his nose. Don't leave him unattended next to a hay net, for example, with a Fulmer in his mouth, because horses being horses, you've got that risk of the cheek pieces getting caught up in the net, that sort of thing. So once you've got past the early days, a D-ring or even a loose ring snaffle, that can be a good thing to progress on to. Now, you'll notice in this particular case, this bit actually has a French link in the middle, and some people view these as being soft and kind and gentle in the mouth. It's not necessarily always the case, actually, as we'll see in a moment. So this is another kind of bit that we see quite frequently. It's a hanging cheek snaffle, and in this case the difference is that instead of the bit hanging from the cheek pieces of the bridle and the bridle being attached to the main bit ring, in this case the bit is actually hanging from these separate rings at the top of the side piece there, and there is actually a good advantage from doing so. If I show you the difference actually to illustrate, here's my Fulmer snaffle, and if I'm mimicking the cheek pieces here, this would be where the bridle is attached, and you can see that the center part of the bit hangs down a little bit in the mouth, and depending on whether you've got the sizing right, particularly if the bit is a little bit too wide for the horse's mouth, you can find actually that the middle part where the joint is there actually droops down on the tongue, and that can be quite irritating to some horses. So with the hanging cheek, if I support it in the same way, so this is where the bit would hang from the bridle. And you can see that it doesn't matter how wide or how narrow the bit is here, the center part of the mouthpiece is actually supported. So the advantage of this bit is that it does actually kind of, the mouthpiece, it sort of supports its own weight. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that having two joints in the bit isn't necessarily always a good thing. And I've taken a photo of the fulmer sitting on a horse's skull that we have here, just to illustrate that. And you'll notice that the bars of the mouth where the bit actually rests, it's a very narrow area. And the problem is that when you have two joints in the bit, they tend to rest pretty much over the bars of the mouth. And if there's any sideways movement at all, or there's any backwards pressure, or the horse is thrusting forward against the bit, taking too much tension in the reins, as you can see, you just substitute one problem for another, because you can end up with quite a lot of irritation in these areas here, either because the bit is pressing down on the tongue and the tongue is then being pressed onto the bars below, or it can be that the horses will withdraw and suck their tongue up in the mouth, and so you end up with those two joints literally resting over the gums, the soft tissue that goes over the bars of the mouth. So if you are going to choose a bit that's got two joints in it, we'd recommend trying something like this. The piece in the center here, some people call it a lozenge, some people call it a peanut. I think there's a manufacturer now calling them a turtleback. But you get the idea. It's a sort of rounded piece of metal in the middle there rather than the flat edge, and so that's going to give you a smoother surface. It's a bit less obtrusive as well, actually, just a bit less metal sitting in your horse's mouth there. Now, a couple of other factors to think about is the thickness of the bit. It's a little bit Goldilocks, actually. You don't want it to be too thick. Sometimes people put a very thick bit in the horse's mouth thinking that it's going to be kinder, a bit softer, but actually it just gives the horse another problem to deal with, because you've got a lot of material in the horse's mouth there. And particularly if the rider's using a noseband, you have to be very, very careful not to over tighten the noseband. And you'll notice actually that we tend to ride without nosebands vast majority of the time. So in terms of thickness, I think the standard thickness for the fulmer is about 14 millimeters, and that would be measured just here at the end of the mouthpiece. If you have a thicker bit, as I say, it just means there's a lot more material in the horse's mouth. If you have a bit that's too thin, on the other hand, then it tends to make the effects sharper. So it kind of reduces the margin for error. So, as I say, Goldilocks, something in the middle, not too thick, not too thin. I think the standard ones are about 14 millimeters. That tends to work pretty well. In terms of the width of the bit, it wants to be just ever so slightly wider than your horse's mouth in the case of a snaffle. So what Jo has done here to illustrate this for you, she's just gently drawn the bit over to one side, and you can see when the bit is snug against the other side of the mouth, not pulling it in so that it's really squeezing, but just taking up the slack. There's a gap here of something like 5 millimeters, maybe a centimeter maximum, something like that. You wouldn't want to have it any bigger than that. And the reality with most bits, actually, most manufacturers, is that getting half-inch sizes is quite easy, but to get quarter-inch in between sizes generally means you've got to spend quite a bit more money, because they just don't seem to be quite so easy to get hold of, and the ones that are available are made by the expensive manufacturers. And in terms of how the bit's adjusted height-wise in the mouth, we want it to be causing the least possible disturbance when the horse is relaxed and giving their mouth, which is the sort of slight swallowing action that you'll see of the tongue from time to time. So we don't really go for the standard two wrinkles at the side of the mouth. You want the bit to stay in contact when the mouth is completely relaxed and the horse lets go of the bit. So it doesn't want to be too long, or too low rather, and you definitely don't want the bit banging on your horse's teeth. But on the other hand, you don't really want the horse to have the permanent smile that he would get if the cheek pieces were too short. So again, you need to adjust it, play around a little bit, and find the Goldilocks area where things are just right. Okay, so there's a quick answer to the question, what kind of bit do we recommend? And also we've explored one or two areas of things to watch out for if you happen to be using a different kind of bit. If you found this video helpful, remember to like and subscribe, and if you've got a question you'd like to know more about, drop it in the comments and we can answer it in a future video. So thanks for watching, and let's have fun with our horses this week.